Well, it's a pleasure to introduce the lecture of Michele Allegra. Michele Allegra is a physicist. Now it is currently assistant professor of physics at University of Padua here. He completed a PhD program in quantum physics. And then, I don't know why, we will ask you to him why, he decided to shift to neuroscience. And he worked at the Advanced School of International Study at Trieste. Then he moved to Marseille with Professor Andrea Brovelli. His study was focused mainly in the study of brain control and dynamic brain connectivity. Now he is here in Padova and will talk to us about approaches to brain control. I think that with his background, this is an excellent example of interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. So, the stage is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me well? Great. So, thank you very much, Alessandro, for your really nice introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and have the opportunity to have this lecture, which I think is really something that is going to be preliminary to the subsequent panel we will have about AI and the usage of AI in neuroscience. Today I'm going to discuss about a topic that I will call brain control. Brain control is an appealing idea. In a few words, it is the idea of using a model-driven approach to design neurostimulation. I believe that so far we don't have this really. So what we have is a set of toy models, and in the upcoming years, we need to turn them into a real tool. In my talk, I will first discuss the current approach to the so-called brain control. And in the second part, I will speculate on how AI might help progressing in this direction. When I received the invitation, I was surprised because this is supposed to be an AI session, and I cannot claim to be an AI scientist. For sure, I'm not a native AI scientist, so I am like most of the people in this room, I guess, somebody who is doing regular science and in the last 5 to 10 years has been forced to learn AI tools because they are becoming ubiquitous and no one is allowed to neglect them in any way. And I think now they are as ubiquitous as they are becoming part of every discipline, including pure physics. So no one is allowed not to know about AI. And I think AI is really promising in actually making use of the vast amount of data that we are collecting in neuroscience. So we have currently a lot of ways to stimulate the brain. Okay, I can quote several techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, deep brain stimulation, temporal interference stimulation, which is kind of more recent. And techniques are being improved in many ways. I'm not myself an expert in neurostimulation. As far as I understand, there is recent work testing multi-site stimulation, so it looks like it's going to be increasingly possible to provide stimulation simultaneously to different locations in the brain, which of course means a significant advance in the way we can provide stimulation. And so we have great techniques to stimulate the brain, but we don't have currently a well-defined theoretical paradigm to design stimulation experiments. Which means the basic question is, where should we stimulate and how should we stimulate to get specific effects? And to answer this question, we might take three different approaches. I believe all the three are valid, but I will make the case for the last of them. So approach number one is empirical. Approach number two is data-driven, using neuroimaging data from EEG or MRI or diffusion imaging. And approach number three is model-driven. And now I'm going to make examples of what I mean by each and every of these three approaches. What do I mean by empirical? I make an example. This is now a classical paper by Pasquale Leone, published in Lancet in 1996. So it's a very old work. And in this article, they reported about the effects of stimulating dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The graph on the top right represents differences in a depression scale before and after stimulation in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay, the authors did not know in advance, there was no theory or they did not know in advance that this would work, but they noticed empirically that providing stimulation to this specific location would result in a mitigation of depression symptoms. And some of the knowledge we currently have about the effects of stimulation has been collected in this way. So there have been experiments, of course not totally random. Of course, they had a question. They wanted to know if stimulation did result in effects about depression, but they did not know specifically where to stimulate. They tried dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and this worked. So some of the knowledge we have is based on experiments that have been performed, and this is of course good, but it does not make profit of all the data we have now. So the step number two would be a data-driven approach. And here I quote another much less old but still relatively old paper by Fox and collaborators. Using data-driven method means, in this case, using structural and structural MRI data. So in this work, the authors looked for each individual subject where the subgenual connectivity was pointing at, so which were the cortical regions that were most strongly connected. And this what you see in the bottom, in panel B of the figure, is a map of functional connectivity. Okay, the blue regions are functionally anticorrelated, which with SGC, and the yellow region is positively correlated. And they use this map for each individual patient to provide stimulation differentially. So they were targeting specifically in the regions that were positively correlated. And they noticed that this resulted in a clinical improvement. So in this case, functional neuroimaging data were leveraged to optimize a stimulation approach. Okay, they stimulated not randomly, but in a region that was specifically connected to the SGC, and this resulted in an optimization of the stimulation. Okay, this is of course good, but in my point of view may not be general enough. So the dream we have, and I am a physicist, so this is probably something that could come to the mind of a physicist. The dream we have is perhaps we could use the dynamical system models to build a very general framework to decide where and how to stimulate. I don't know your background, so I'll try to be simple in formalism. Please raise your hands if you have questions or if I'm saying something strange. Please stop me. I know some of you come from psychology, from engineering, from physics, so it's normal. At several points I may say something that is not clear, so in this case, just stop me. Okay, in dynamical system modeling, we first define the system state. And the system state at each time is just a vector that I call x. Do you see my pointer? Okay. Okay, in this case, assume you want to model the brain that has been parcellated into a certain number of regions. Then you have a vector of n components, each component representing one region of the brain, and in this case, x is the activity of that region. Okay, depending on the data you have, this might model different types of activity. If we are trying to model fMRI data, this typically assumes that hemodynamics has been regressed and that what you have is a sort of macroscopic activity of the large brain region that is belonging to a parcel. I say large because of course, even if you divide the brain in 100 parcels, this is still large compared to cellular size, so it's really macroscopic. Once you define the state, you can define dynamics, and this equation that I wrote is the most general formulation of a dynamical system. On the left-hand side, you have what we call a derivative, which expresses the rate at which the system changes in time. The state of the system changes. And on the left, we have a function of the current state plus an external perturbation. Okay, and the specific form of the function f determines how the system evolves in time. Okay, this is the general equation for a dynamical system expressing the rate of change of the state as a function of the current state and external stimulation or perturbation in general. And this equation, when solved, gives the trajectories of the system in time. If we are equipped with such a model, assume we start from a certain initial state, x at time 0, and we want to achieve a certain desired final state at time capital T, and I call the desired state x star. We might ask, what is the external perturbation that will actually steer the system towards the desired final state? And in principle, for a certain class of dynamical system, we are actually able to solve precisely this question. How? This would go in 2 steps. Step number 1 is reconstructing the dynamics, a step which is traditionally called system identification. And after system identification, we have a model of F. So we know how the system changes as a function of its current state and external perturbation. And then we can use algorithms to find the perturbation that will lead to the desired final state. In principle, any algorithm we use will need to have constraints. So we might not ask only this, okay? We might ask that, so we certainly want to achieve a certain target state, but we might take into account other constraints such that we don't want the external perturbation to be very strong. Typically, we want to get to the right state with the weakest perturbation possible because of energy, because actually if the perturbation is strong, maybe it can cause damage and so on. So typically we add another constraint such as getting to the right state with the minimum possible energy, where the energy is just the integral of the control so U is a perturbation that is applied. Okay, this control energy is the square of the perturbation summed up in time. Okay, so it's how much, how strong the perturbation signal is across time. And we want this to be weak as possible, typically. Okay, I say we can use algorithms, but in principle, we don't have many algorithms to do this, unless we consider special cases. And the most studied case is that of linear control. Because for linear dynamical systems, the control problem can be solved exactly. And even though linear systems are a special class of systems, they are very important because all systems close to an equilibrium point can be considered linear. Okay, a linear system has this type of shape. Again, this is just the previous general equation for a special case where the system is linear. And a linear system here has two sets of parameters. One is called A here, and it's the connectivity matrix. And then another set of parameters is included in another matrix B called input matrix. Let's make an example. Okay, please focus on this system. This is it's a toy example. This is a network of 4 units where the arrows represent directed connections between them. Okay, the matrix A encodes the directed connections, and the directed connections actually mean that a certain unit will have the state of a certain unit will affect the state of other units in the future, okay, thanks to this equation. Then we have the matrix B, which is just specifying which nodes are being perturbed. Okay, in this case, there are 2 nodes that are being perturbed, node number 1 and number 2, and this matrix encodes for that. And then we have 2 control signals or perturbation signals. Okay, so this vector U is 2-dimensional. We have 2 so-called driver nodes, and to each node we apply a different stimulation or control signal. Okay, if we have a system of this type, the problem of designing a perturbation leading to a target state has a complete solution. In fact, there is an analytical formula to select the optimal control signal. Okay, I write it here not because I want to discuss. I really don't want to go into the details of this formula. What is relevant here is that we do have a formula, which means the problem is solved. So there are a few ingredients, the matrix A, the B, the initial state and the final state. And once we have these ingredients, we can plug them into a formula that will tell us what is the optimal perturbation leading to the desired final state. Okay, this is a beautiful theoretical paradigm, and this is why it has been used many times in engineering for controlling many types of systems. And back in 2015, the group of Daniel Bassett proposed to apply this type of theoretical framework in neuroscience in a seminal paper titled Controllability of Structural Brain Networks, published in Nature Communications in 2015. In their work, they adopted some simplifications. So they consider the brain as a network of 100 nodes, so they use the relatively coarse brain parcellation. And they assume that the matrix A, the matrix A which encodes which region is influencing which other region, they assume that the matrix A was just equivalent to the structural connectivity as inferred from diffusion tensor imaging. And then they studied what would happen when stimulating each and every node. So in the plot in the right, you see a map that represents the energy, the average energy that is needed to control other brain regions starting from a certain location. So here you have the red areas are areas such that you need more energy to control other parts of the brain, and the blue are areas such that you need less energy. And then they discovered, they made some network analysis and discovered in their work that this controllability was related to a network property, which is the weighted degree, which is just the sum of all connections. So what they discovered was that hubs of the network, hubs of the structural network, were regions from which it is easier to control other brain regions. Okay, so if you want a schematic view of the result, is hubs are the best control regions, because if you stimulate a hub, it's easier to control other brain regions. Easier because you need less control energy. There were many subsequent papers and following the approach of Gu and Bassett. And in a recent paper, we provided an edit to their paradigm. In that, we thought that the limitation of their approach was just considering the matrix A to be proportional to the structural connectivity. Of course, as you may know, DTI has some limitations. For instance, it provides a completely symmetric structural connectome, and we know that the real structural connectome is probably not symmetric. It will feature relevant asymmetries. Also, it's not evident that assuming an equivalence between the matrix A and the structural connectivity is correct, because the downstream effects of activity of an area need not be fully proportional to the amount of anatomical connections. So we propose to use an effective connectivity inferred from functional MRI instead of the structural connectivity. So we used a strategy which is called dynamic causal modeling. I call it a strategy because a DCM, a dynamic causal model, is not a very special model. So DCM typically is a bilinear model, is a very general model, what is relevant about the DCM is the inference strategy, so it's how you fit the model to the data. And we leveraged work done here in Padova by the group of Professor Bertoldo, who developed a very precise form of DCM by which you can fit functional MRI data to retrieve an effective connectivity that best represents the timing relationships observed in the functional MRI signals. And the model is very simple. Again, there is a matrix A, which is, in this case, is not assumed to be proportional to the structural connectivity, it's just estimated from the data. There is some noise, and then the neural signal X yields a BOL signal Y by means of a hemodynamic response. Okay, so it is assumed that, of course, we do not have access to the pure neural signal. What we have access to is the BOL signal, and we assume that the BOL signal is just given by a hemodynamic response that builds on the neural signal X. So equipped with fMRI data, we can infer all the parameters of the model, including the matrix A, which is the matrix of causal interconnections in the system. And we try to see what happens if we attempt a linear control approach in this case. So this is a recent paper we published in PLOS Computational Biology. I don't want to discuss all the results we have. It's not the focus of this lecture. I will just limit myself to a couple of considerations. So we devoted a lot of attention to the simplest scenario, which I also consider possibly one of the feasible ones, which is trying to activate a specific target by providing stimulation only to one driver. And we studied the control energy, so the strength of the perturbation that is required to activate a given target using only a given driver. And we looked at the relation between the control energy and the effective connectivity, which is represented in these plots. Okay, in the bottom left, you see a scatter plot representing the relation between the effective connectivity and the control energy. And in words, okay, you have in red the positive connections, so-called excitatory connections, and in blue the negative connections, so-called inhibitory connections. And we saw that essentially what this graph tells is that if there is a strong connection, okay, if you are here, there is a strong positive connection between the driver and the target, then the control energy is going to be low. Okay, and surprisingly, this is effective also if you have a negative connection. So in presence of direct connections, the control energy is low, but in order to have a low energy, you do not need, so the reverse is not true. You might have a low control energy even if you don't have direct connections. Why? Here is in the center plot, there is a scatter plot between the control energy and the path length in the effective connectivity network, which also includes the effect of indirect connections. Okay, so the reason so how can we explain this graph in this way? So what is relevant is the presence of a short path of effective connections between the driver and the target in order to have low control energy. And it is important to see these relations. It is important to use effective connectivity. If you try to do the same with standard functional connectivity, you don't see the same result. Correspondingly, we obtain a message which is similar to the message given by the group of Bassett, but with a small detail. So we consider the driver energy, so how much energy is needed to control all the nodes from a given node. And we saw that this correlates with the out strength, so the number of outgoing connections in the effective network. And we were able to define such a measure in the first place because we have an asymmetric measure, because we have effective connectivity which is non-symmetric, so incoming and outgoing connections are not equivalent. And then we also studied target energy, so how much energy is needed to control a specific node. And we discovered that this correlates with in strength, so how many connections a node is receiving. And in a word, what we can say with this approach is that tendentially, nodes with many outgoing connections are good to be selected as drivers, because in order to excite the target, you will need less control energy. And nodes with many incoming connections correspondingly will be good targets, in the sense that it is going to be easy to excite them starting from other remote nodes. And I think, unfortunately, so we can get, I think, with our approach, which is a small edit to the bus set approach, because it's, okay, we replace a structured connectivity with effective, but conceptually it's the same approach based on linear control. I think we can have predictions and perhaps say something about what is the best location to stimulate if you want to reach a certain target. So this is the type of predictions we can have. And this, I think it's time to test them. So we are going to test them in experiments and see whether this is effective. But in many ways, this is limited. And in particular, I want to stress that something that we cannot do. So in the original paper by the Bassett group, there was a claim that the brain is theoretically controllable through a single region. So they seem to make the claim that just by providing stimulation to a single region, you can create an arbitrary activity pattern in the whole brain. And we think that this is not feasible. This is even mathematically controversial. It's also easy to understand why this is hard, because here, if you look at the desired final state, this is the state space of the system. Each axis is an independent unit to be controlled. If you use a parcellation with 100 regions, it means you are trying to control 100 units. And actually what you see, if you do the analysis correctly, is that the control energy becomes exceedingly large unless a large fraction of nodes can be used as driver nodes. Okay, I just show it here. Okay, this on the bottom left is the energy in logarithmic scale. How much control energy you need to control all the brain, depending on how many nodes you simultaneously use as drivers, and this has this type of scaling. Which means unless you use at least 15 nodes here, okay, here we put a cutoff. This is the reason of this behavior. So we said above 10 to the 12th is exceedingly large. We don't even consider as reasonable. But mainly this plot is saying that unless you control a significant fraction of all the nodes, so maybe 30 nodes among 50, you're not able to control the whole brain with reasonably low energy. So this means that actually, even though in principle one could say we can control, we can surely not do this in practice. It's going to be even difficult in simulations. So not even if we go to the real experiment, but even if we try to simulate control, with the discretization that is inherent in the simulation, we might have problems. And so this is a dream, because now we can provide stimulation simultaneously to maybe 1 or 2 locations. We are not going to be able to create an arbitrary activity pattern. So what we can do now with control theory is limited. It's limited to giving predictions about perhaps the optimal location to evoke a certain activity pattern. So let me recap what I said so far. So assuming linear dynamics, we can fit a model to fMRI data. And using linear control theory, we can identify optimal driver nodes for specific targets. And in principle, we also know how to stimulate the drivers. And by using only 1 or 2 stimulation sites, we can control the activity maybe of a few targets. We cannot control the whole brain, for sure. And this approach could be tested to inform experiments in TMS or TES, transcranial electric stimulation. And I think this is promising, but even this is limited. And so in the second part of the talk, I'm gonna try to make it in 15 minutes. I'm gonna discuss how perhaps AI tools could help us progress in directions that are relevant for our goals. Okay, even though I think that the approach I described could give some good predictions, still there are issues in that the model used is absolutely simplistic. Okay, we have a linear model which at best can be considered as an approximation that holds for very slow time scales. Okay, so it might be okay because we are trying to represent fMRI. So to give an idea, I think this is kind of valid for frequencies below 0.5 Hertz. So for slow and long time scales. The problem is that the stimulation typically deploys its effects on much faster time scales. So if you use TMS, for instance, TMS uses stimulation frequencies that are much larger often than 0.5 Hertz. And so we are not sure that this linear model will provide a good account of the effects of stimulation. So I'm really concerned by this. So I think one of the real problems we have is we are probably not going to model correctly the effects of stimulation because this model is optimized for very slow time scales. And if we want to go towards something better, we need to use more advanced, complex, non-linear biophysical models that are apt to consider faster time scales. Okay, as an example, I quote a model that has been used a lot by the group, has been developed and used by the group of Professor Deco, where each area is seen as containing 2 populations of neurons, an excitatory population and an inhibitory population. And the basic model contains 2 differential equations that are non-linear, as one can see immediately, and that, however, feature short time scales. So this model is in principle good to simulate real neural events occurring on time scales from 10 to 100 milliseconds. And this model can be used as a whole brain dynamical model if you couple together different regions. Okay, so in this case, a single brain region is modeled in a complex way by means of the activity of 2 different populations, and then the populations are connected. This can be done to model whole brain activity. But one of the main problems is to fit the model to the data. And here is where one of the examples where more advanced tools coming from AI can help. Okay, okay, this was just to show, okay, the model is very complex, so these are two dynamical equations, and then each of the variables has to be specified, so there are additional equations. I don't want to focus on this. What I just want to show is that this, in principle, is going to model the effect of a perturbation in a more refined way compared to the previous model, because here there is essentially, this is a firing rate. In the main equation for the excitatory population, you have the firing rate of the excitatory population, which in turn depends on an input current, which in turn depend on the external stimulus. So there is an external stimulus that has an effect only on the excitatory population, and this is just to say that this type of model is a much more nuanced way of depicting the effect of stimulation compared to just saying plus U, okay? Because in the basic model, we are just adding the external stimulation to, so in the previous model, we are just saying it's X plus U, if we want. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, I have to go back a lot. Okay, this plus U, and we were modeling each region just by one variable, so it's much less precise. Okay, one way AI can help is into fitting complex models to the data. Okay, complex models, they feature many parameters. In this case, for this biophysical model, there are 3 parameters that are not known in advance, that are the connections, the average connections between the excitatory populations. The average connection between neurons of the excitatory population, the average connection between neurons of the excitatory and inhibitory and excitatory. These are 3 parameters that are not known, and in principle they might be local, so they might be different for each region. So these are a lot of numbers that need to be tuned if you want the model to correctly represent data such as fMRI data. And so there is a problem of optimizing parameters to reproduce the functional data. And the basic idea is to define a cost function. In this case, typically the difference between the functional connectivity observed in the model and the empirically measured functional connectivity. And then the idea is to find the values of the parameters that minimize this functional. So the values of the parameters leading to the smallest discrepancy between the model and the empirical functional connectivity. So the idea is what you see here. You have a simulated functional connectivity, an empirical functional connectivity. The difference between the two determines a loss function, J. And then this loss function depends on the parameters of the model, and one has to use a gradient descent method to navigate the space of parameters in order to minimize this function. And this navigate the space of parameters is means minimizing a loss function over high-dimensional parameter space, and this is exactly what typically happens in a neural network. Just a question, how many of you are familiar with deep learning? Everybody? Okay. I do a super quick comment on this. Okay, so this is like in a nutshell. I know I'm not doing justice to deep learning, but I try anyway. So what you see here in the top left is a deep network. What a deep network does is a set of units that computes a function. So you have an input X. The input is undergoes some transformations in the units of the network, and the network gives an output Y that is a function of X plus a lot of parameters that are the biases and connections of the network. Then you have a training set of inputs and outputs. You have a loss function that depends on the inputs and the output, typically the difference between the output of the training set and the output that the network is giving in the input. So here you have yi is an output in the training set, xi is an input, f of xi is the output that the network gives, and we are trying to have the network give as output exactly the output that is in the training set. This is the process of training, and the process of training is done by minimizing this loss function over all the parameters that are the weights and biases of the network. And this is done by a procedure called gradient descent, which is shown here intuitively. So on the two axes, you have two weights of the network, two parameters, and this on the z-axis you have j, the cost function. This very rugged surface represents the values of the cost function depending on the parameters of the network, and what you're trying to do is to find the minimum, and the gradient descent is trying to look for directions of decrease in this hypersurface until you get to a minimum. And then technically, those of you who are familiar with deep learning know that this gradient descent in the case of network is implemented with the backpropagation algorithm. Okay, so trying to fit a model by minimizing a cost function or training a neural network seem to be very similar problems. And in fact, in a recent paper, it was shown that you can actually exploit the similarity, which is not only a similarity, but is an actual equivalence. Okay, this is work by Griffiths. It's still not published, but has been used also already used in several studies. And I selected this because I think it's a nice example. What they were able to do was to recast the whole dynamical model, the one I described, so the model by Deco. They recasted it as a recurrent neural network. I show this intuitively. So here the input to the network is the noise that is provided at each time point. Then they have a recurrent layer where each of the node is one of the nodes of this complex model. So they have excitatory and inhibitory population evolving with the equation of the model. And then you have an output, which is a functional connectivity that is compared to the empirical, defining a loss function. And then all of this can be written as a recurrent neural network, and actually it can be easily implemented in PyTorch. And by just doing training of the recurrent neural network in PyTorch, you can optimize the parameters of the model. In this case, they are not the weights, they are not the connections between units, but the local parameters. And they were able to do this, and they showed that they obtain a much better fit of the model to the data. Okay, so one of the applications of AI will be possibly that of using a lot of data and then become better at fitting complex models to the complex data. In the last 5 minutes, I quote another application. I'll go quickly, otherwise I don't have time for discussion. Assume we are good and we are able to fit a more complex dynamical model. Then, as I was saying, this probably is going to be a nonlinear model. So what can we do if we want to control it? It turns out that neural networks tools can be used also to solve this problem of controlling a complex nonlinear model. There exist theories. So the field of nonlinear control has produced a lot of work, but we don't have a general way of dealing with nonlinear systems, and the underlying theory is very complex. And thanks to advances in machine learning, now it is becoming much more easier to deal with nonlinear systems than it was before. Okay, here I quote this work. Also, it's Nature Communications of 2022. Okay, we want to control a certain nonlinear system. Again, we have the dynamical system here, which now is, again, general. I'm not assuming it to be linear. And then we have a cost function, which features the control energy and the discrepancy between the final state that is reached by the system and a target state. Okay, this is a cost function we want to minimize. And the idea of this paper is we can numerically solve the system of this complex nonlinear system. So we discretize time, and at each time step so we solve the equation by discretizing time. Okay, for any of you familiar with the dynamical model, this is going to be pretty intuitive. So knowing the state at time 0, we can easily compute the state at a very small time after, okay, at time tau, because it's very easy to integrate the equation just for a very small amount of time. And this can be iterated many times until we get the whole trajectory. And the whole trajectory depends on the value of the control signal u at each of these time steps. Okay, so the final state reached depends on this function, and this function u is an arbitrary function, so it can be expressed through a neural network. Okay, a neural network is very expressive. It's capable of expressing pretty much arbitrary functions. So here we have a complex function of time, and we express it using a neural network. So time is an input, and the output are two components that are the two values of the perturbation applied to two locations. And in this case, weights and biases in the network determine the trajectory. And hence they can be trained to minimize the cost function. Okay, so we have a cost function that depends on the final state, and we can try to minimize the cost function to determine the optimal parameters in this neural network, which is expressing the arbitrary signal. Okay, and the idea is at each time step, the value of the function u determine the dynamics. At the end of the dynamics, we can compute a cost function, and by trying to minimize this cost function, we can go back and try and optimize the parameter of this neural network, which is representing the input that is applied. And in this way, it is possible. They showed, the authors, that it's possible to have a stable numerical control. Okay, this is not based on any advanced theorems or theory, but it's performing very well. I'm not claiming that this is going to be the way to control a nonlinear system, but I think this type of scenario is going to be increasingly useful to try to serve that objective. Okay, I'm going to skip the last part. Okay, let me go to conclusions. So I think the idea of using models to inform brain stimulation raised great expectations, such as those raised by the paper by a group of Bassett. And current approaches are based on simpler linear models. And I think that they might have some worth in providing good indications about where to stimulate. But I'm convinced actually that more complex biophysical models are needed to account for stimulation effects in a more rigorous way. And I think that AI tools will be increasingly used to both fit the models to the actual data that might become also multimodal data, whatever. So the sheer amount of data is going to increase in the coming years. And AI tools are going to be required also to try to achieve principled control schemes and to try to steer a nonlinear system towards a desired state. Okay, let me thank some of the people I've been collaborating on this type of topics in the last years. Karan Kabur, Giorgia Baron, Alessandra, who's also an organizer, Maurizio, who's also here. I don't know, I think he's not an organizer, but I'm not sure. Samir Suvais, who's a physics professor here. And let me thank again the organizers, so especially Lorenzo, Alessandro, and Paul-Jean for the invitation. It was really a pleasure to be here. And I also thank the Big Brain Consortium and all the partners for this opportunity. And I leave space to your questions. Thank you very much.
Hello, yes. Thank you. It's a really fascinating talk. One of the questions I had is a few people in this room, I guess, are involved in trying to increase the resolution of the parcellations that we're using for these things. And I was wondering, how do both the linear and the nonlinear system effectively scale when you massively increase the number of nodes that you're applying these at, effectively increasing the resolution of your parcellations? How do these types of models scale?
I reply, it's a very bad situation. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. So this is one of the main problems. Okay, let's forget about control for an instant and let's just concentrate on step one, which is system identification. Okay, in my case, we are trying to infer effective connections. Effective connections scale quadratically with the resolution of your parcellation. So of course, already we are very limited because the only way to have a good estimate, then I also have, just to reply you to this point, I think if you have 100 regions, the individual estimate of effective connectivity you get is not reliable. I have a paper on that. So even if you want to, at a group level, it's okay, but if you want to go at an individual level, things become, already with 100 regions, the estimates are to be taken with some grain of salt. Of course, we need to scale up. How can we get out of this conundrum? I think we cannot unless we have models that incorporate more and more knowledge. So I think one of the limits here is, I believe that the effective connectivity we infer is a better representation of the timing relationships and the causal effects that the sheer structural connectivity. But if we want to scale up the system, we need to have strong priors, also constrained by, for sure constrained by structural connections, because unless we do so, we are going to run into trouble. I believe so the real problem is connectivity is whatever parameter that scales quadratically with the parcellation. So if we have local parameters, this is going to scale linearly. So I'm not saying it's going to be okay, because going from 100 to 1000, it's one order of magnitude. And it means maybe for doing some reliable estimates, you wouldn't need 10 times the amount of data. So things are not easy. And this is a problem that is not so well recognized because one problem with AI is that AI is wonderful, but it works when you have a vast amount of data. And in neuroimaging, we do not have vast amount of data in the sense that is often required for AI. So this, I mean, if you have 100 subjects, is not enough to infer many things. So you will need 1,000 or hundreds of thousands. So I think we probably to do a really effective model of whatever model you try to fit, you will need strong priors. So you will need to constrain the model a lot using existing biophysical knowledge. and you will need fine recordings, not very noisy ones, and long ones. So I don't think it's going to be necessarily easy. And for the control part, if you just look at control, the problem is not if you try to perturb a specific region, this does not scale, so it's not a problem. But if the objective is trying to create a pattern involving many regions, the scaling is exponential. I did not have time to discuss, so with an exponential scaling, it means this places very, very hard limits to what we can do. Exponential, unless you can control simultaneously, you can stimulate many, many sites, which is not, we cannot envisage in the short future, I think.